Amnesia the Bunker is brilliant at what it does. Tense corridors, suffocating darkness, systems-driven terror, and a monster that feels less like an AI routine and more like a living, breathing horror. But once you finish it, that brilliance doesn't hold the same weight anymore. The first playthrough is suffocating because every step you take feels dangerous. Every match you strike and turn of your light source, it strips away hand-holding. It removes scripted safety nets. It refuses to comfort you with linear progression. The central hub structure creates a tense loop of exploration and retreat, forcing you to venture into hostile territory, scrambling back to the generator-lit safe room of the sanctuary. The scarcity of resources is suffocating. Bullets are precious. Fuel is your lifeblood, and every decision feels weighted with genuine consequence. The game's systems interlock beautifully. Noise attracts danger, darkness breeds vulnerability, and curiosity is constantly punished. It is an experience that demands caution, patience, and nerve, and on that first run, it feels revolutionary because it trusts the player to learn through fear rather than exposition. The problem is not that the design is flawed, in fact it is almost too well designed. Its mechanics are transparent once observed closely, the beast operates within parameters that become rather readable over time, the bunker's layout, initially labyrinthian, condenses into familiarity after repeated navigation. The dynamic tension that once felt organic begins to reveal its seams. This is not a game built on narrative twists or branching story revelations, it is built on systemic tension, and systemic tension, once mastered, loses its vitality. The horror thrives on not knowing. When you know, truly know, the experience shifts from survival to optimization. The fear doesn't vanish completely, but it does change shape. It becomes technical rather than emotional. So the phrase, brilliant but only once, is not meant to be an insult. It's an acknowledgement of design philosophy. Frictional games crafted something so meticulously tuned for first-time dread, for that suffocating initiation into darkness where every sound feels lethal. But in doing so, they created a horror experience that peaks during discovery. It is unforgettable, it is intelligent, it is masterfully constructed, yet it is also bound to the fragility of surprise, and surprise is a resource that can never be replenished. The opening hours of Amnesia the Bunker are some of the most tightly engineered horror sequences in recent memory. Not because they overwhelm the player with spectacle, but because they restrain themselves with surgical precision. From the moment you regain control in the dimly lit central hub, the game establishes a rhythm built on hesitation because you are not sprinting towards objectives. You are inching forward, listening and measuring risk. The bunker's architecture is deceptively simple, yet psychologically complex. Its interconnected corridors loop back on themselves in ways that create both relief and dread. Each shortcut unlocked feels like a hard-earned victory, yet each new door opened expands the perimeter of danger. The brilliance of the design lies in how it forces you to internalize space as something hostile, something that must be studied and respected rather than conquered. On that first ascent, the bunker feels infinite, not in size, but in threat potential. The generator system amplifies this tension into something almost unbearable. Light is no longer aesthetic, it is currency. Fuel becomes a ticking clock that governs every expedition. Do you top up the generator before venturing out, sacrificing precious resources for temporary security? Or do you risk exploring in near-total darkness, relying on sound and memory to guide you? The safe room is not truly safe, it is simply safer. The generator hum becomes a false comfort, a reminder that safety is conditional and temporary. When the lights flicker and die, the shift is immediate and visceral. The bunker transforms. What was navigational becomes alien. What was familiar becomes suffocating. That transformation on a first playthrough is devastatingly effective because you have not yet built the confidence to counteract it. The beast's introduction is equally masterful in its restraint. It is not overexposed, it is not explained in clinical detail, it is heard before it is seen, implied before it is confronted. The scratching inside the walls, the sudden eruption from a hole in the concrete, these moments imprint themselves deeply because they feel unscripted. You do not know the boundaries of its behavior, you do not know how forgiving the AI might be. Every noise you make feels like a potential death sentence. The first time it hunts you successfully, the panic is genuine, unfiltered, and unforgettable. It feels less like losing a game and more like being outsmarted by something predatory. Crucially, the game refuses to over-tutorialize its systems. There are no intrusive pop-ups dissecting optimal strategies. You experiment under pressure, you test mechanics while afraid, and that combination, learning while threatened, burns the experience into your memory. The first descent into the bunker feels personal because your mistakes are yours, your survival feels earned, and that sense of earned survival is what makes the playthrough not just effective, but extraordinary. The transformation from terror to technique does not happen instantly. It creeps in slowly, almost imperceptibly. You begin to recognize patterns in the beast's behavior. You notice how long it lingers after a loud noise. You understand which tools reliably deter it and which are desperate measures. The unknown starts to shrink. Corridors that once demanded slow, cautious advancement becomes efficient routines optimized for resource collection. You are no longer reacting blindly. You are planning. And while planning is empowering, it also dilutes the fear. The bunker loses some of its psychological mass because you now occupy it with confidence rather than dread. The generator ceases to feel like a lifeline and becomes a manageable variable. You calculate fuel consumption with detachment. You ration light, not out of panic, but out of strategy. Darkness becomes inconvenient rather than paralyzing. You understand that certain threats are localized. You realize that some risks are exaggerated by your imagination. The oppressive atmosphere remains visually intact, but emotionally it softens. Mastery introduces predictability, and predictability undermines tension. The system is still brilliant, but brilliance understood is not the same as brilliance experienced blindly. Because the narrative is sparse and deliberately understated, there are fewer narrative incentives to replay it. The story provides context, not complexity. There are no dramatically divergent endings or radically different narrative revelations waiting on a second run. The emotional arc remains largely the same. What changes is your relationship with the game's mechanics, and once the mechanics are internalized, the experience inevitably contracts. The games become shorter, not in hours, but in psychological resistance. What was once a game that felt like an ordeal now feels like a challenging run. This is the paradox at the heart of systemic horror. The smarter and more coherent systems, the more learnable they become, and control is the enemy of fear. Amnesia the bunker thrives on the player feeling small, uncertain, and overwhelmed. When that uncertainty is replaced with competence, the horror does not disappear, but it no longer dominates. Atmosphere is the game's most powerful weapon, and on a first playthrough, it is truly suffocating. The distant rumble of artillery outside the bunker reminds you that the world itself is collapsing. The confined corridors amplify every footstep, every metallic scrape, every echoing thud. Darkness feels physical, pressing in from all sides. The soundscape is layered with subtle cues that blur the line between environmental and imminent threat. You strain to listen. You hesitate before every door. The bunker feels alive, breathing around you in slow, oppressive pulses. That sensory immersion is extraordinary and deeply tied to the unknown. But atmosphere relies on perception, and perception changes with familiarity. Once you have navigated every wing of the bunker, once you have catalogued every room and shortcut, the oppressive maze becomes mapped territory. You no longer imagine infinite threats lurking in unexplored corners. You know where dangers tend to emerge. You anticipate ambush points. The tension does not vanish entirely, but it does become muted. The bunker transforms from an unknowable labyrinth into a navigationable system, and that transformation is irreversible. The beast suffers a similar fate. Its first appearances are shocking, unpredictable, and deeply unsettling. Its later appearances are expected. You recognize the triggers, you anticipate the patterns, the creature's design remains grotesque and imposing, but it's the mystique that fades. It stops feeling like an unknowable predator and starts feeling like a reactive mechanic. The emotional impact diminishes not because the design worsens, but because you have adapted. What lingers after completion is memory rather than urgency. You remember the suffocation, you remember the generator dying at the worst possible moment, you remember sprinting blindly through darkness with the beast in hot pursuit. But returning to the bunker after all of that feels different. It feels studied. The magic of that first descent into the bunker, the raw uncertainty, the suffocating ignorance cannot be recreated, and without that ignorance, the horror cannot burn nearly as brightly. Amnesia the Bunker stands as one of the sharpest examples of focused horror design in recent memory. It is confident, disciplined, and ruthlessly committed to immersion. It does not rely on cinematic spectacle or convoluted narrative twists. Instead, it builds tension through interlocking systems, environmental storytelling, and psychological pressure. On a first playthrough, it achieves something remarkable: sustained, suffocating dread rooted in uncertainty. But that uncertainty is finite. Once exhausted, it cannot be restored. The systems remain intelligent, the atmosphere remains meticulously crafted, the design remains admirable. Yet, the emotional volatility that defined the first descent fades with your understanding. The bunker eventually becomes manageable. The beast eventually becomes predictable. The darkness becomes familiar. Brilliant, but only once, is not a dismissal. It is merely a recognition of intent. This game is designed to terrify through ignorance, and ignorance is a one-time experience. In that sense, its limited replay value is not a flaw, if it is the cost of its precision. It delivers an unforgettable initiation into fear, it imprints itself deeply, and then, like all great horrors rooted in surprise, it leaves you with memory rather than simple repetition.